Welcome to our first series of conversations on religion in society. My name is Imran, host for today's discussion, put together by the Institute of Chinese Buddhism. In this series, we are looking at bringing leaders from different sectors to dialogue on issues of common concerns and motivations for the good of society. This dialogue hopes to understand life's outlook, concerns, and strategies pertinent to the development of a multi-religious and multicultural society like Singapore, and to also promote as well as inspire values that are shared across the religious traditions and those without professed religious affiliation. Today's topic is on religious motivation and social reality. Religion is a deeply held belief and conviction. It forms one's worldview with values that often inform, consciously or not, our daily conduct, the way we live our lives, and the way we interact with others. It also forms our identity and binds us as a community. But the social reality is that the world is shrinking. With globalization, we are confronted with multiple forms of diversities, and the world is no longer a distant place with the strange others. These others are now our neighbors, our colleagues, our friends, as well as our family members. The world today is in our backyard, even in the palm of our hands, and think of the handphones that we have right now. This essentially is the social reality. Being people who belong to a religious faith and hold a religious identity, we need to ask ourselves today, what does it mean to be religious in a deeply diverse world? To help us answer this question, we have three distinguished guests today. And first, we have Professor Yaacob Ibrahim, advisor to the President of the Singapore Institute of Technology and a former minister. Welcome on board, Prof.
Thank you very much for having me.
And second, we have on screen today Venerable Dr. Juewei, who is the Director of Humanistic Buddhism Center at Nantian Institute, Wollongong, Australia. Welcome, Venerable, all the way from Australia.
Thank you for the invitation, Imran.
And third, we have Dr. Kweh, a lawyer at the KSC GP Juris LLP, and also a Vice Chairman of the Education Subcommittee of the Singapore Buddhist Federation.
Really honored to be here. Thank you.
So we are exploring the question of religious motivation and social reality. So Professor Yaacob Ibrahim, now Singapore is a secular state, yeah? But 80% of the population profess to belong to a faith tradition or another, yeah? And what role do you think faith has to play in this secular yet multi-religious society?
Sure. Well, thank you very much for asking the question, because I think it's a very pertinent question for a secular society like Singapore. First of all, we must not forget that freedom of religion is actually enshrined in our constitution. Article 15, for example, guarantees that every person has the right to profess and practice his religion and to propagate it. But of course, the freedom is not unfettered. There are rules that bound us in terms of general law to ensure that public order is of course maintained. So within that milieu, there is a recognition that people have a right to have a religion, and therefore that becomes part of their identity. So in a multi-religious, multicultural society like Singapore, where the state is secular, faith communities actually have an important role to play in many different areas. One of which obviously is to acknowledge the existence of different communities. By its very nature, faith communities recognize that all of us are parts of God's creation. Therefore, our existence acknowledge that, basically, right? So I think that's the first thing that faith communities can do. Second thing, obviously, because we are part of this society, there's a need to coexist. Because of the fact that everybody in Singapore has a right to profess to a religion of his choice, therefore we have the right to exist, and therefore there is a need to coexist with one another. We cannot be exclusive. We must try and find space for each other. But I thought the third most important thing that I think faith communities can play an important role is to ensure that we can work together to achieve a better future for all of us. After all, our faith demands that we look after each other because they are part of God's creation. How then can we work together to make sure that the world around us is a much better place, not just for us, not just for our family, but for our neighbors, our colleagues, our friends? So I think faith communities can be that glue, actually, as part of an overall social glue that hold the Singapore society together. We may be different outwardly, but inwardly we share many, many common things. We believe in the idea of a creator. We believe in creation. We believe that we need to look after each other because that is how our faith informs us in how we should behave towards one another. So the notion of being a good neighbor, for example, is deeply entrenched in all religious belief, right? And your neighbor is not your choice. Your neighbor could be somebody of a different faith, a different community. So what do? You close the doors, or you open up your hearts to them to bring them in as much as they should also bring you into their world, basically. So I think being that social glue is very important. To hold that center, I think the faith communities play a very important role, especially in a secular society where the government will actually be very interested to make sure that society also remain intact, remain cohesive. But the government doesn't have the moral mandate from a faith community because it's not religious in that sense. But it can play that part to bring the various communities together. So I think that is the one role that the faith communities can play, to make sure that the society holds together, be the glue that binds all of us as a nation, and work together to make this place a better place for all of us, for their children, our children, and for the generations to come.
Thank you, Prof. You mentioned about neighbors,
Yes.
but sometimes neighbors do disagree. And also people of different faiths have different ideas about religion. Sure. How do you think we can deal with these differences?
I think it's a matter of recognizing that each and every one of us have a right to agree to disagree. But more importantly, I think to help find common ground. I think the disagreements sometimes can't be overcome. If it's a matter of, the way you pray bothers me, and when you burn your incense, it comes to my home. When you chant, it wakes me up in the middle of the night. I think we have to try and reach out to them and explain to them why it's necessary. And I think at some point in time, we also may have to calibrate what we do and what we practice so that we can also accommodate each other. I think that sense of accommodation is very important. I think we cannot insist that this is our right, our religion says so, and therefore you have to accept it. Remember, I quote the Constitution. The Constitution gives you the freedom, but that freedom is not unfettered. So there are rules by which we must live by, basically. As long as within that space, you can continue to practice your faith, but in a manner I think should bring good rather than to bring unhappiness to the people around you. So I think the most important thing is communications, understanding each other, and perhaps have that magnanimity to recalibrate what the things that you're doing so that you can actually bring people together. To me, harmonious living is far more better than you being able to practice your faith and actually incurring the wrath of your neighbors. I think that's not the outcome that we all want.
Thank you so much for that words. Moving on to Dr. Kweh, can one actually compartmentalize one's personal faith and social conduct in the public sphere? Now, if yes, how does one remain faithful to one's true beliefs, but at the same time, it does not cause social tensions, especially with different expressions of religiosity in public life?
So to begin with today's topic, I must say that yes, I have my own religious and spiritual values after learning and practicing Buddhism for many years. These have shaped and drive the way I relate to my social world and interactions. So to your first question about whether one can compartmentalize one's feelings and values, I think there are basically two aspects to this. One is, the first question you ask is, if no, if yes, right? If you can compartmentalize your feelings and your values, how does one do this while remaining faithful to one's true beliefs? And then there's another part to it is, the question is, if no, then how does one remain faithful, yet not allowing expressions of difference in public sphere does not create social tensions? I think from the way that my spiritual values and the training that I have shaped the way how I approach this is basically two ways. The answer is yes and no. Yes. If you're talking about a short term, then I would say yes, one can and one should compartmentalize. Let me explain what this means. In Buddhism, we have a concept called skillful means, upaya. It means that one should be able to adapt to the environment and to the situation. If it is a situation whereby you're going in only for a short term, just temporarily, Then in that sense, then I think it is possible to compartmentalize, to keep your feelings or your values to yourself, and in a way compromise and adapt to what the situation is. Like I mentioned, this is only for a short term. So it's quite situational. You have to look at it. If the short term is just a few hours or a few days of interaction, why not? This is because when one compartmentalizes one's feelings and keep one's feeling to oneself, we know that psychologically tensions arises within your values inside and perhaps values outside, which seems to contradict your internal values. And we know that being able to compartmentalize one's values and feelings is nature's way of coping. I call it a coping mechanism. We know that studies two kinds of situations whereby compartmentalizations of one's feelings and values are quite prominent. One is in the area of trauma cases, where patients having feelings like this use this as a coping mechanism so as to avoid perhaps greater stress. But this is more in terms of short term. And we also have studies of children who are now starting school to interact with societies. So for that sense, I think, yes, we can compartmentalize, but the situation is that it is more for a short term or temporary a period of time. But if we go on a longer term basis, from the viewpoint of citizens having to live together, then I think it is important it is important that we should not compartmentalize our feelings and our values. In Singapore, I mean, as a citizen and also as a practicing Buddhist, I hope that all of us, all citizens, can be free to express themselves in the way their religion would like to express themselves, in the way they dress, in the way they visually present themselves to the society. So for example, for my Muslim friends, I would like to see them putting on, for the ladies, their headgear, or what you call the tudong. For my Christian friends, to wear the medallion that display their crucifix. For the Buddhists, their amulets. For my Hindu friends, I used to see that about 20 years ago, but these days I don't see them. You know, when my Hindu friends come to work, you would have known that they have gone to the temple because they would have the holy ash on their forehead. And I think this is good for the longer term. And I think we should encourage people to do this, but with one caveat. The caveat is that these things can only exist when we have a very high level of tolerance, a very give and take feeling, you know, an environment, and whereby citizens have cultivated a high level of mutual respect and understanding. And I think this is something worthwhile to invest in the Singapore society. Why do I say that? Is because Singapore is very unique in the sense that we have many different cultures, many religions, many ethnic groups living side by side together. I do not personally think we should follow some countries where they have an overriding doctrine or perhaps a more superior or priority policy relating to racial, religious, or ethnic group. I call this sometimes the majority rule. This is quite common in the corporate scene, whereby the majority shareholder controls everything. Or sometimes I call this the rule of the fittest and the strongest. And I call this the rule of the jungle. In the rule of the jungle, it is the fittest and the survivor, the fittest and the strongest that survive. I think we should strive for a more compassionate and wise society for Singapore. And what does this mean? It means that the majority and the strongest must always look after the weakest and its minority. Be they our minority group, be they the poor, be they the disadvantaged, and even our handicapped and LGBT. We must make sure everybody feel like this is home, as the song says, like home truly. And I think this is important because For me, from the religious point of view, this arises from 4 values that I hold dear. One is because of compassion. The second is wisdom, or what we would call, in other words, justice. The third is what I would call causes and condition. And for this to happen, certain cause and condition must arise. It is not something whereby one factor can determine, but perhaps a multiplicity of factors. And I call this an internal and an external factor. Internally means that individual citizens must cultivate that kind of open-mindedness, open-heartedness necessary for this kind of culture to grow in the Singapore society. The fourth is very important to Buddhists, is the concept of interconnectedness, whereby everybody is connected to each other. We have a saying that a flap of a wing of a moth in North India can cause a hurricane or tornado in the south of India, subject to the correct causes and conditions. In other words, what this means is that someone who does something, perhaps in the Singapore scenario, let's say a person who stays in the rental flat at, let's say, Chin Swee Road, has an impact on someone, a fabulously rich person who lives in the high-end housing estate in Singapore, provided the causes and conditions are there. This is like the effect of a ripple effect. Someone drops a stone in the middle of a pool, given the right causes and conditions, the ripple will eventually reach to all the other parts of the pool. Overall, I think it is important for the Singapore society to cultivate this kind of values, both, as I mentioned, by the individual citizens, as well as externally, whereby governments must come in, community leaders must come in, religious leaders must be involved. And for many years, I think this is quite absent in Singapore. Organizational leaders must also play an effective part in creating that kind of environment. So in the end, it is important for all of us to cultivate this open-mindedness, this ability to have the mind that uphold mutual respect and understanding among everybody in Singapore.
Thank you, Dr. Kweh. That was a very comprehensive answer. In fact, a couple of points that I picked up. It's important about the whole idea of restraint also. Yes. Yeah, being in a multi-religious society, in the short term, sometimes there need to be compromises. At the same time, also restraint, even though we may disagree. I hear also, just now, Prof was talking about the religious freedom, and I like your point about the protecting the minorities, because sometimes we think of religious freedom in terms of our own benefit. We are free to practice our religion, but can we accord that to other communities, that they are also free to practice the way they feel fit, according to their conscience? And minorities especially is a very important area to look at. Yes. And of course, it's not just religious minorities, but minorities across the diversities, yeah? Thank you so much for that. And I think we move on to Venerable Juewei, all the way to Australia now. Of course, Venerable Juewei is a Singaporean, but she's now teaching in Australia. And Venerable, if I may ask you, in Singapore, there are many social welfare activities administered by faith-based groups. Although these organizations do not generally discriminate in their provision of services to the general public, they are self-organized along religious lines. Is there a need to transcend the silos and faith-based organizations to now start thinking about working together interreligiously to solve some of society's pressing problems like poverty, health issues, even environmental issues that cut across all the communities? What do you think, Venerable?
Respond to your question. Please allow me to express my gratitude for the opportunity to digitally meet my fellow Singaporean friends. I've not returned to my homeland for 2 years now and really miss the sights and sounds of our Lion City. Next, I would like to share a beautiful tradition that I've learned from my new home in Australia, and that is to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we walk on, study on, and reside on, the Wodi people of the Darawal Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend those respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of today. In the same spirit, I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which you and all our viewers reside. I will return to why this is important later. I've left Singapore since the turn of the millennium to pursue study and my faith in Buddhism overseas. Hence, I must profess that I'm now quite unfamiliar with what is happening on the ground in the Lion City. So after this full disclosure, I'm now ready to proceed to your question. I tried first to understand why you said that many social welfare activities are self-organized along religious lines. My research reveals something that I should already know, that the Singapore government implements a decentralized welfare system that encourages self-reliance and self-responsibility so that individuals first turn to their own savings, such as CPF, the family units, and local communities before turning to the government. My early years in Singapore certainly confirmed that. Even today, I see faith communities offering social welfare services to their adherents, neighbors, and anyone in need. When I was last back home in 2019, I witnessed Fo Guang Shan, Singapore, offering bursaries to needy students in the Punggol neighborhood. I am also a beneficiary of such charitable systems. Until her last breath, my mother stayed in an aged care home run by a caring Christian community. So having understood where you come from, Imran, I'd like now to give you my take of the theme of today's podcast about religious motivation and social reality. I'd like to say a few words about social reality. Let me quote Stanford University's Professor Kenneth Taylor's take on social reality. Social realities are creations of the human mind, he said. When a group of people come together, they agree to create a social reality. For example, the aged care home my mother stayed in for 4 years, or the bursaries program. They are all social realities resulting from one human mind connecting with another human mind. I want now to talk about another two types of realities, environmental reality and personal reality, because they are related to the issues you raised. The environmental reality from a Buddhist perspective is what a human mind sees of the natural world. Let me put a stark reality before you, something that I worry about as well. Singapore is facing the reality of losing this land we call home to rising sea levels and rainstorms due to global climate change. We ought to be very concerned with the outcomes of COP26 because its impact is existential to us. At a personal level, the reality is our inability to connect with ourselves. Mental health issues are on the rise. And as of August this year, there's an estimated 13% of the Singapore population experiencing anxiety or depression symptoms. So your question, Imran, I would like to reframe as what religious communities can together do to relieve these existential threats, social, environmental, and personal. You are right. These issues have become too immense for any one religion to offer a holistic solution to the entire population. Since most, if not all, religions share one common mission, and that is the relief of suffering, and one common language, that of compassion, faith groups are the most logical place to start. And this is aligned with what Professor Yaacob said about finding common ground. In Buddhism, like what Dr. Kweh has said, the religious motivation is usually based on a deep understanding of our interconnectedness and that we are all equal as brothers and sisters in suffering. You asked about the feasibility of inter-religious welfare communities. My internet search did not surface any inter-religious welfare or action-based groups in Singapore. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But here in Australia, I'm aware of the Australian Religious Response to Climate Change, ARRCC for short, consisting of members from the Anglican, Baha'i, Baptist, Buddhist, Catholic, Hindu, Islamic, Jewish, Uniting Church, and other traditions. My friend, Gowan Powell Davis, who is the chair of the Buddhist Council of New South Wales, is also on the ARRCC Management Committee. This multi-faith network is very active in compiling resources and initiating actions on climate change. However, I think to truly solve existential problems such as poverty, hunger, health, and climate change, the solution goes beyond welfare projects. Instead, I see interreligious communities coming together to craft powerful and compassionate responses to systemic problems. Perhaps let's start with encouraging everyone in our communities to press the pause button so that we can create a position of stillness. And then from this position of stillness, let us learn to deeply listen, listening to ourselves, to one another, and to nature. Let us move away from a pursuit of independence with this acquisition of wealth and self-protection to a quest of interdependence with care and generosity. Can we reassess the situation? Are there little things we can do to be kinder to ourselves, our friends, and to our environment? Can I change my lifestyle to cope with climate change without losing my mind to the fear of it? I like what Elizabeth Gilbert said recently, that it is about making small and intimate interior transformations without adding to the drama, the pain, and the chaos. So I return now to the acknowledgement of country as a little thing I do publicly. I wish to honor the Malays from the Malay archipelago as the traditional owner of the land I call home. It allows me to pause and be grateful to the conditions that gave me the privileges I enjoy today. And from this position of abundance, I hope to find myself less grasping and less wanting. I then can make room for others, whether they are religious or not, in my life, because we share the same human condition and vulnerabilities. So I'm afraid that I've given you a very long-winded answer to a simple question. I sincerely hope that a variety of faith-based, cultural, educational, and governmental communities can come together to awaken everyone to the calamities ahead, so that we can co-create systemic solutions that are sustainable to the personal, social, and environmental landscapes we face. And like what Dr. Kweh said, this is the open-minded and open-hearted, wise and compassionate society we look forward to. No one person can do this. We must do this together. And this is how we can make this feel like my home truly. Just be like saying, Majulah Singapura. It's been such a long time.
Thank you, Venerable. Yes, certainly, I can't recall also any inter-religious organization along humanitarian lines, but we do have organizations that offer humanitarian support and help across the faith communities. We do have Mercy Relief, for example, that do disaster relief work regardless of religion or communities or ethnicities. I remember also the interreligious organization do disburse help also during disasters, but you are right in the sense that there's no specific interreligious group, and that's probably something we need to explore here in Singapore. And your example from Australia is very interesting, because I think ultimately we face the same existential threat, especially with climate change. And it's time that we move and look into interconnectedness and also develop this idea of interdependency. I think that's the only way forward, especially in today's world with a multi-religious society like Singapore, which is also not isolated from the wider world. So thank you so much, Venerable. Thank you so much, Dr. Kweh, and also thank you so much, Prof, for this conversation. And I hope it will inspire people to think more about these issues and about what faith means in a multi-religious society, and also with the social realities that we are facing with. And we work towards alleviating pain and suffering, and also to create the common good that all of us can aspire towards. Thank you so much, and we look forward to meeting you again in the future conversations. Thank you.